everybody. I would like to welcome you at this panel session. It has to do with standards and their role and within the General Data Protection Regulation. GDPR, as you may all know, is a technology-neutral legal instrument which, despite this fact, endorses some self-regulatory instruments such as certification and standardization or technical standards. Actually, technical standards are referred within the legal text not only as a good practice, but as a means of transparency from the data controller, enabling him to demonstrate transparency and correspondingly accountability, but also as a means of achieving compliance with the legislation. In 2015, the European Commission issued the first standardization request to the European standardization organizations to produce such relevant standards. However, the history of privacy-related or data protection-related standards goes far beyond this point, earlier within the early 2000s. The final text of the GDPR as it stands right now makes explicit references to technical standards within Article 43 and Article 42. So it's apparent that technical standards, on the one hand, are already mentioned within the legal provisions, and on the other hand, we have the experience from traditional information security that they are widely used, not only at a European, but at the international level, in order to ensure uniform application of predefined set of rules and procedures, which is also something that we're trying to address today, including also aspects such as data portability, which is also mentioned within the text of the regulation. My name is Prokopios Drogkaris, and I would like to welcome you again in this panel. And next to me, I have the moderator of this panel, Mr. Alex Lee, who comes from Microsoft and is a senior public policy analyst. And his role is to support Microsoft teams and, principal standards analyst from Microsoft. Sorry, I was reading the wrong CV. And he's responsible for enabling global regulatory consistency, business growth, and customer trust with international standards. Next, I would like also to introduce our three panelists. There was a last-minute change, and I would like to start with the latest addition, Ms. Ali Lang from Google, who kindly accepted to join us in this panel. Ali is a senior public policy analyst based on Google's Mountain View office, and she supports the product teams and represents Google's privacy work as a public policy representative. Next to Ali, we have Jan Schallaböck, who is a lawyer by training and practice, and currently he's a partner at a Berlin law firm, iRights.law. But before that, he was also a member of ULD, the Data Protection Authority, one of the data protection authorities in Germany. Last, and he's also involved in the standardization activities of ISO, where he has been active for more than 10 years. Last but not least, we have Babak Jahromi, again from Microsoft. He's an IT standards architect at Microsoft, and he has a 20-year-old experience in the software industry with extensive experience in development of operating systems, middleware, and application frameworks. So with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to the moderator of the discussion, Alex. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Just a little logistics. What I'm going to do today is to start with a session of time for each of the panel speakers to talk about the topic of their choosing, and it will be relevant, obviously, to the subject at hand. And then I'm going to raise some questions between the overlapping points among the speakers. Then after that, we'll open up the floor for Q&A, and if no questions come, I have backup questions. And I also will, unlike many other sessions that I attended, I will open up the panel discussion also to our chair. First, because he is just as well qualified to answer many of these questions as our panels. I don't want to rob us of the opportunity for his participation. And of course, we also are missing one panelist due to illness, so we want to have a full participation. So this is how I'm going to run things, and without further ado, let's have Jan kick off our sessions.
Thank you. Well, let me first of all thank you for the invitation. It's great to be back at CPDP. It's always a pleasure to be here and meeting so many smart people and have an exchange on the topics at hand. I was asked today to give a talk of some of my work, or our work, in Working Group 5, or to be more specific, in ISO, IEC, JTC1, SC27 Working Group 5, which is the ISO working group developing identity management and privacy technologies. And obviously that relates to some of the aspects of the GDPR, and how exactly that relates is going to be part of the talk today. The overarching theme is how do standards and GDPR relate at all? And obviously, talking about my working group, where I have the pleasure of vice chairing that group. This is only going to be a small subsection of the work in standardization and GDPR, but I guess, and from the previous discussions I had, it's a substantial subsection, and I'd like to give you a short overview of what is going on there. But I would not want to dive into that before making the clear point that standards usually don't have a direct legal implication. They're mostly non-mandatory, and especially in the context of the GDPR, there is no specific reference to specific standards. So the GDPR doesn't require to implement or to be compliant to any document that ISO produces, and that is the case for most standards. There's few exceptions in some areas. For some legal areas, there's the concept of harmonized standards, but which are not applicable in the area of the GDPR. And I guess the topic of how standards and law do relate is going to be a topic for the discussion later on. And I want to first set the scene to some extent with some contributions and examples from our working group, showing that our work may be helpful. Before I do that, I want to give you a very short overview of Working Group 5 and what Working Group 5 is. You may have noticed this complicated name. It's ISO, IEC, JTC1, SC27, Working Group 5. And that sounds like a deep hierarchical structure, and it is. Nevertheless, we produce the output and the standards within our working group, and the reason for why that is such deep enshrined into the hierarchy is because we're a working group within a cooperation of IC, the International Organization for Standardization, and IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. And they have built a joint committee, Joint Technical Committee 1, and this committee then has subcommittees. And that goes from subcommittee 2 to subcommittee 42. I'm sorry, yeah. And that would be, and right in the middle, there is a committee on security technologies, which to my knowledge is one of the largest committees because of obvious reasons. Security techniques have been of an enormous importance in the context of information technology. But there's many others, and some of the panelists will probably highlight those as well. However, I'm going to be talking about Working Group 5, which is a working group within SC27. There's other working groups that deal with security evaluation with ISMS. Just a quick question, who of those in the room is aware of the ISMS and 27000 series, just to show hands? Okay. And which is widely used in the industry. There is a working group of security controls, and there's also working group 2, which deals with cryptography mechanisms and has been in the press last 2 years a little bit more because of some intricacies with certain standards that I'm not going to dive into, but please ask me afterwards. Working group 5 itself has a set of privacy standards, and I'm going to highlight only a few of them. But this is an overview. We have different application areas. We have standards on the general framework level with management standards. There's implementation-oriented standards. There's some that highlight specific technology aspects, and there's supporting documents, which is the SD4, which actually describes on how to make standards that take into account privacy by itself. And another important aspect to understand what I'm going to talk about is how the work in SD27 or in ISO is organized. It goes, we're working in committees or working groups, and each document, each project goes through several steps, starting usually with a study period or eventually a new work item proposal. And then first we're talking on expert level, which is working draft, and you'll see those abbreviations later on through the talk. From working draft, we go to committee draft, where not the experts are the ones to decide, but the members of ISO, which is usually the standards organization of the member countries, of the national bodies. And then if we're getting closer to the end, there's going to be a draft international standard and final publication as an international standard. So that's the process, and I think that's very good to keep as a background and knowledge, because I know and understand that ISO work can get confusing most of the times. So with that said, let me dive into some of the relevant standards that we have in Working Group 5, and I know this is pretty small, so I'll highlight those in a little more depth. We made a quick assessment recently on where we have standards projects already out there and how these map with articles of the GDPR. And as you may see from this list, given the quality of your eyes, this is covering far beyond the areas of Article 42, 43, and 44. There's many other areas where standards can actually help implement and comply with the GDPR. And probably this is not even a comprehensive list. It's just the ones that we quickly figured out that would relate. And I'm gonna go for and pick out 4 of those to just give you an idea of where we're going. And the first one I'm going to be talking about is the 29100, the Privacy Principles Standard. And this document is not so much of importance actually because it relates to GDPR, but it is a very important document because it serves as a basis for all the other work in the working group. It defines the terminology and the principles underlying the privacy work in our working group. And the important aspect here is this document actually took 4 or 5 years to develop because it also serves as the consensus of the group on how we understand the field. And if we're talking about privacy, there's always this notion that there is different cultural understandings of privacy. So this document really describes the common denominator. And it's also important to understand that in standards, if you want to use standards for compliance, especially international legal compliance, you have to find a common denominator that's not the least common denominator, but that's kind of the sum of requirements coming from all kinds of jurisdictions. And if you look at those set of principles, and if you look at the terminology, you will see and be able to map those with principles enshrined in the GDPR and with terms in the GDPR. But for example, in our standards, we use the term PII with a definition that maps to the definition of personal data, but the term PII is used. To give an example of a standard that is already that's currently under development, and that's kind of tackling a topic that I've been seeing a number of times during the CPDP. There is a project that's called Guidelines for Online Privacy Notice and Consent. And this, in my view, is one of the most interesting projects, but also one of the most challenging. Since this concept notion and the transparency notion is something that's still under heavy and hefty discussion within lawmakers in the policy sphere, but it's also very rewarding to see something coming out of that. While all the other documents that I'm going to present, this one is still under development, is scheduled for publication in October 2019. So this also goes out to you. If you're interested in getting involved with Working Group 5, please approach me afterwards. I'm happy to find ways for you to get integrated and to get involved with the work. Some of the work that is already published is the work on the 27018, which is a document that can be used for PII processors, and that already now helps me in my daily legal practice because by law, when I'm a data protection officer acting for some organizations, whenever there is data processing going on at a different constituency, I would have to be looking into that organizations and control whether they're complying with the law. Now, you can probably imagine what would happen if you have like a large data center with 10,000 of customers, if all of those 10,000 customers would drop by and look whether they have their security in place. The security would be gone, essentially. So by using that standard as part of an ISMS certification, I have a certificate that actually data protection agencies most of the times do accept as a replacement for my personal control of the data center. So that is one of the best examples where I can see that tremendously helps. But it's also important to notice and to note that DPAs are not enforced by any means to accept that, but they also have an interest to accept such standards because there is a common methodology, so it makes their work easier as well. Another example I want to give is the 29134. We have developed a privacy impact assessment methodology, and I believe there was the Ping journal lying around, which also had an article about this one. We just recently tested how well that fits with the requirements of Article 29 Working Party as well as the GDPR, and we found that the 29134 methodology maps very well with the GDPR and it delivers ways to demonstrate compliance with most, if not all, requirements the GDPR exposes. And finally, of course, there's more work out there. One example that we're currently looking into is a German standard that defines a mechanism and a concept for deletion. Deletion is a very important topic and often overlooked. Hopefully this will then develop into an international standard and serve as a common grounds. And there's a number of standards that I skipped, for example, the famous 27552, which is a very promising project, and there's lots of involvement of both industry and data protection agencies in the development of this document, as well as a thing that we're not addressing in Working Group 5, which is data portability. And with that, I think I also delivered somewhat of a bridge towards Babak. But before I hand back to the chair, I would like to thank you for your attention and point you to the next meeting of Working Group 5, which is going to be in Wuhan and then in October in Oslo. And for further information, feel free to look up on the slides or approach me afterwards. Thank you very much.
All right, Babak, you have the chair. You have the mic.
Clicker.
You have the clicker and the mic, not the chair.
Let's wait. Do I have to click for the next one?
You just kill it. Yeah.
Did I kill it? Oh, look there. So as we wait for the slide, so Jan did a good job of covering the standards that coming out of, coming out of SC27 part of ISO IEC. I'm going to cover, I'm going to go pick a couple of the standards that he mentioned and then go a little deeper in my coverage and show you how standards could help with this complex task of complying, understanding, and arriving at a consensus about how to conform with GDPR. So did I do something wrong with the slides?
We just have to wait.
Do you have to wait? Oh, there you go. Thank you. And then that's half of the presentation, and the other half I'll talk about open source and how standards and open source can both be beneficial to the task of working with GDPR. So the first one that I would like to talk about is this one, standards coming out of the cloud computing part of ISO IEC 19944, which is called data flow, categories, and data use. Before I talk about the standard, think about what GDPR is about. It's about data. It also talks about de-identification of data and whether how to anonymize things. And for example, my favorite reference to this case is Article 29 Working Party's opinion on data portability, Article 20. They've done a great job of describing what the spirit of Article 20 is. And in their attempt to be more precise, more pragmatic, and more to the point, they felt the need to invent some terms about types of data. For example, you see things called preferred data, inferred data, or observed data, or captured data. These are all new terms that they felt the need to define in order to do a good job of telling us what the spirit of Article 20 is. Now, wouldn't it be nice if the international community had come together and built a comprehensive taxonomy of data so that we can all have a more pragmatic, meaningful conversation that reflects the international consensus? The good news is the answer is yes. In October of last year, this international standards was published. And what it does is, part of what it does is it offers a taxonomy for data that flows between devices and services. And I'm not going to lecture you on the details, but just notice that there's a categorization in green. There is categories of de-identification of that data in orange here, and processing and use that I won't talk about today. But here's a way that international community has come together to reflect a consensus. And one thing I should have added to what Jan covered about the international standards process in ISO and IEC, a layman, like when my dad asked me, what do you do for a living? The way I describe it is, I'm in US Olympics team, but I'm really not an athlete. So the way it works is in ISO and IEC, every country sends a delegation to the debate. And they all, instead of competing over sports and metrics, they debate on technical merits. And if there is a consensus, then there will be a document, and then everybody votes, and if the vote passes, then we've got international standards. In this case, that international community came together, and there was a consensus. And in that voting process, it's important to remind everybody that US gets one vote, France gets one vote, China gets one vote, Estonia gets one vote. So it's fairly difficult for the bigger countries to try to manipulate, because at the end of the day, even if you didn't participate in the process, you can still go vote as a country and bring it down if that's not what you like. So it's a fairly healthy process, that's my point. So back to this taxonomy. Let me give you one more level of depth in the data categorization. So I talked about the preferred data in Article 29 Working Party, or captured data. Some of that is implicitly captured here. So it's good to know that when we want to talk about conforming or understanding GDPR better, knowing that GDPR is inevitably going to have a global impact, wouldn't it be nice if we had our conversations about conformance in the form of foundational concepts defined in internationally accepted documents? And this would be one example. I also mentioned another part of this is this standards has a data categorization. It also, another part of it that relates to GDPR is that this standards defines a precise, dare I say, scientific reflection of the de-identification process that GDPR talks about. And this is, again, another example where the international community has come together and achieved a consensus. And in this case, there are 5 levels of de-identification. You don't have to read the fine print. Come talk to me, and I'll give you all the details, or you're welcome to download the slides. But my point here is that there is a consensus, international consensus, to talk about these complex topics, and that's a good thing when it comes to understanding GDPR. I want to have a shout out for another standard coming out of Jan's backyard, 20889, which is in the process. Jan had a slide on the process of different steps in creation of an international standard. This one is in, I think, second CD, and it's pretty close to completion. This one maps to the previous standard. It has those 5 levels of de-identification, but it also covers the processes that you have to go through in order to achieve that level of de-identification, which I think is fairly powerful. And again, it's a reflection of the international community. So when it comes to big vendors such as us, trying to have a global service, we can ship a service for Europe and one for China and one for US. So it is good if the international community could come together and have something that held water so that we could all rally around and map it again to the GDPR. So this is an example of how international standards can help people and on all the stakeholders develop a better understanding of how to work with GDPR. Another one that important standards that Jan mentioned is this one that is still in the process of, I think it's reached the first CD back in Berlin. This one, as Jan said, it builds on existing certification that we have a robust ISMS, Information Security Management System certification and standards a series of standards that back them. This one is using the existing framework, but adds privacy controls. So given that we have an existing robust certification for security, wouldn't it be nice if you just use the existing framework and address privacy controls with it? So this is what the standard does. Again, so when it's done, it can be a foundation for certification, just like the security foundation standards are. Again, it's an international consensus, so even though it can be mapped with GDPR, it reflects international consensus and it can be applied internationally, not just for Europe. In fact, as Jan pointed out, there are some DPAs in Europe that are participating through their so-called Olympic team, their national bodies. CNIL is one of them. I think Germany is as well, right? So this is really truly when it's complete, it will be a reflection of international community. And the way it's done, it's mappable to GDPR. So let me very quickly give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's talk about Article 20, which I think Ali and I were going to, at least I'm going to talk about the data portability part of it. In this case, Article 20 can be mapped to a control. Control is a thing you have to do, basically, a thing you have to worry about, right? So there's a control in that standards listed for data portability that can maps to Article 20. And for that control, the standard offers a set of activities you can do have to keep in mind, you have to perform in order to be okay there. So in a way, it's a way to operationalize, to first scope out, itemize, nuggetize your GDPR commitments, and then operationalize them inside your company. So it's a very, very proven method for all companies, small or large, to adhere to certain set of goals that are listed here. One other standard that Jan mentioned, and this is done in the Cloud Computing Subcommittee of ISO IEC. This one is for interoperability of in the world of cloud computing. This one has 3 areas. One is interoperability. The other one is, the second part is application portability in the cloud. And the third one, which applies to our GDPR discussion today, is the data portability in the world of services. Just to show you that, just give you a feel for what the standards are, it's a foundational standard in a way that it's not really certifiable, but it gives, just like 21900 that Jan mentioned, it gives you some foundational understanding of what it means to have interoperability or portability of code or data. When it comes to data, I just copied a piece of it here. It talks about different facets that is required for portability. For example, first of all, everybody knows it's obvious to say that to have portability, syntactically the data has to be portable and understandable. But that's not enough. Semantically, it has to also be portable and understandable. And by semantics, what we mean is the true underlying meaning of that data. And whether there is understanding on both sides, the sender and the receiver, is there a true understanding of the underlying meaning of this data? And of course, there has to be policy portability as well. and which goes back to things like geolocation and things like that. So how much time do I have, sir?
Are you over time?
I'm aware. Okay, okay. Sorry. Sorry, Ali. So I will skip there. So talking about portability, let me give you another thing. So part of this talk was about open source as well. Some of you may have heard this debate about standards versus open source. There's camps on either side, and it could be pretty dicey. We believe, at Microsoft at least, that these are all different tools for the trade. You use the right standard for the right cause, like in this case for potentially certification. You use the upcoming privacy management, but there's some cases where standards just doesn't cut it. And there are cases where open source would be a better solution to their problem. Data portability is one example of that. Yes, you can have JPEGs and things like that, but for the data to be truly portable from source to destination, you can't, to just use the existing minimal data, if there are data standards, you will have to dumb down to common denominator, and that will be a loss of fidelity, loss of functionality. So in this case, this is a case where open source is a better tool to address portability. And with that, let me just give you one way that the open source community can come together to address something like the automated data transfer that is envisioned in Article 20. In this diagram, the left blue is source service, the source of data, let's say Microsoft, I don't know, Outlook, calendar, or contacts. And the destination would be a similar email service somewhere else, some other company. In this model, people could write a plugin to download the data from Microsoft side or from whatever vendor that they desire, write a piece of code that shows how that can be done. And then on the other end, the receiver will write a piece of code to parse that data that was serialized, that was downloaded and serialized, deserialize it, and then upload it or persist it or send it to the destination service. And this is the case where, because it's done in code, and the code is written is is for the pair of the services that are picked. Therefore, there will be less of a chance of loss of fidelity or functionality. So that when the data shows up on the destination service, there's a higher chance of the data to be accurately and completely having been transferred. I won't say much more about this. If you have any questions or any feedback, or come find me. My email is also on the slide deck. With that, I think I'll hand over to the chair, or sorry, to the moderator.
Oh, Ali, let's just pick it up from there.
There we go. I think you have to wait.
Oh, to be patient. That's not something I'm very good at. In the meantime, I can let you guys know. So as I mentioned, I joined the panel a little bit late, but my name is Ali Lang. I work in the public policy department at Google. And instead of talking about sort of the general standards process, we thought we would give you guys a quick look into our data portability world and pick up some of the comments that Babak was making. Normally this presentation is a bit longer, so I'm going to have to just be as fast as possible. It would help if it appeared, maybe. No?
Those electrons take time.
Yeah, I don't know. How did we do it last time?
We just waited.
Stop pushing the button.
There.
Aha, fantastic. So I'm so excited. So we'll just do like a really quick tour, I promise, to our moderator and chair who are trying to be good timekeepers. Just give you a sense of the history and the present of data portability at Google, a little bit about the principles and values that underlie the work that we've done, and then a quick look at one of our sort of what's next kind of universes. So Google's actually been thinking about data portability for over a decade. The earliest blog post we have on it is from 2009, and in that blog post, Brian Fitzpatrick, who is one of the engineers who pioneered that work, mentioned he'd been thinking about it for a couple of years already. But in 2011, we created a centralized place to what we call download your data at the time, and it's sometimes called takeout, that allowed users to sort of come to one spot at Google and access the things that they wanted. So because of that, we have a good sort of sense of what people are looking for in portability. I know that people have seen it a bunch of different ways, but internally the common use cases that we see for portability are to back up and have a copy of data, to sort of use specific pieces of data to send to other places, to transfer things to other companies, and to migrate between accounts. Account migration is a common use case for data portability within Google. As we mentioned, we sort of created this centralized place, but we found that folks still didn't really know that this existed. So now we've sort of integrated it a little more thoroughly into our products. You can see in this slide, there's actually a spot if you go to your My Account page, when you click on any particular sort of type of information or product you use, you can go down and you can see the options to download your data there. We offer downloads in industry standard formats to the extent that that's possible. And we also offer something that Babak was alluding to, which is sort of, hang on, I can't read my own. There's another option that you have for how you can directly send it. And as you can see, you can directly send it to some other services. In this example, you can see it's Drive and Dropbox or OneBox. So your data can be directly sent so that you don't have to download and re-upload to another place. So the purpose for this is to sort of reduce the difficulty of porting your data. Just some quick metrics for anybody who's interested. We don't need to go into them given the time, and that this isn't really about that. So in the spirit of the conversation about standards and sort of interoperability, one thing that Google keeps in mind when we're doing all this is really it's a principle-driven decision. We try to make it easy for folks to decide what products they want to use and where they want to have their data. And for us, a particularly important point of view is to sort of the idea that you want to try something new. The world of technology is always growing and changing, and so trying something new is an important sort of background step that we have. But here you can see just a few of our top-line principles. Let me see, what's the most important ones to focus on? One thing that's really interesting to think about as far as the open source and standards debate is that if you're looking at industry trends across the board, one thing you see is that people are really trying to reduce the infrastructure burden on the individual. This is part of the reality of a world that operates largely on mobile devices. For a lot of us, we may think of portability as downloading and re-uploading data or storing a hard copy of our data. For big sections of the world, that's just sort of not practicable. The infrastructure is somewhat limited, and it creates a huge burden to sort of manage that kind of process, both in cost and just in time and difficulty. So one thing to think about is, what is going to work globally, what's going to work for people everywhere. The standards process they're talking about works for, it sort of gets a flavor of the world, but it's interesting to think about what are the physical limitations or the infrastructure limitations in different places. And that's part of our sort of user-first approach, right? Thinking about users and thinking about users globally when we're making these decisions. One last point on the practical application. As Babak was mentioning, for us, some of the most important features are that it needs to be flexible. The standards that we use to sort of decide what file formats things are in, what's the process, how are the adapters working, all of that has to be flexible and adaptable over time. Partly because in order for people to be able to confidently try something new, they have to be able to use whatever format that new thing is operating in. So flexibility is really important for data portability to achieve its policy goals and the goals that it's meant to achieve. Another important point is it needs to be reciprocal. We certainly don't want to create a world in which people can port their data into a place and then they can't get it back out. Right, the whole universe has to be equally connected in order for people to really see the benefit of portability. So there have to be some agreed upon kind of guidelines and rules as far as that is operating in order for that to be practicable. The standards the words we think of to describe the standards we want to see in portability are open, consistent, and interoperable, right? Really thinking about how do we make a universe where people have maximum choice, where companies are incentivized correctly to not sort of keep people in one place, and where we really can imagine a future that's different than the present and has a lot of benefits for users and for companies. As I mentioned, it's actually really interesting that folks don't know a bunch about Google's data portability offerings. We expect that'll change this year. But yeah, I think that it's really important in general for us in a practical sense to make user-focused decisions. So for example, when we're looking at the use cases we most often see, it's actually not about, for example, we see folks more interested in duplicating their data in a sense than we do in reducing their data footprint, which is very interesting. Just a couple of final points so that we can get to discussion. one thing that we're looking at, and one thing that is really important for the future of data portability, is to figure out how to expand the direct service-to-service portability. This is the distinction I'm making between downloading and re-uploading your data, and instead doing something where it's more like the data moves automatically from one place to another. Currently, we're sort of solving the majority of this problem by giving a local device, but it's just bandwidth is expensive, and it really is not a sustainable future. Instead, it would be better to be able to transfer it directly somewhere. This is a pretty big change to how portability works now. So there will be a lot of standards to be worked out, both norm setting and just sort of file formats and other ways that we would go forward. I don't think we need to go in this or that. Okay, yeah, so all this information is like full of good ideas, but it's a little bit interesting to think through like a scalable solution. We should try to build sort of a small one and see if it works. Assuming that we can build a service-to-service portability solution, one thing we need to be sure is that it works for everyone. And in order for it to be successful, there needs to be a wide range of companies that participate in that process. So small, large, established, new and growing, technology-focused, and even sort of more traditional companies. Like if you think about all the ways that data exists all over the world, in other industries as well. And also think about regional applications. As we mentioned, there's a lot of countries and places in the world that face unique challenges. And so you'd really want to have both a diverse and interesting group of folks. And once you have sort of the proof of concept, you can look to sort of the promise of a cheap and easy access will sort of draw more companies in and create a more interesting experience. And yeah, it's the kind of process that's not 100% perfect right away, but that over time we think will be more sustainable and build on the principles and values and the success that Google has seen already in portability. So I think I was under time, and I think I should get a reward for my panelists.
Rub it in.
Ali made up for Babak's mic hog hugging. So he's my colleague, so I can make fun of him. So thank you very much for the panelists for your discussion. So now we're on to the panel discussion portion of the session, and I will invite the chair to participate if he sees fit. So the first topic I would bring up is that actually reference to Jan's one of initial slide where he mentioned that standard does not necessarily usually have a direct implication to legal compliance. And that actually runs counter to some of my experience. For example, in anti-discrimination laws, a lot of regulations are written, it's pretty much universal around the world. You cannot discriminate against people, say, with disabilities, for example. Now, when it comes to building a building and making sure the building does not discriminate, and a person in wheelchair, for example, certain ramps has to have a certain degree. Now, no regulations that I know of would specify what degree the ramp has to be. But yet, if your ramp is too steep, the lawsuit can sue, right? And the way to measure whether there is the ramp is too steep is based on standard. So very much as a field matures, it is the norm that regulations relied on standard to measure compliance. Now I understand that maybe GDPR is not quite there yet, but can you maybe talk about where it's going to go from here in that regard?
That's a very interesting question. The answer is short. It's complicated. That's actually a legal field I've been interested in for quite a while, and there's so many different cases that one can look at. Alone in the GDPR, there are several different cases, and things that you mentioned are in different sectors, and in those sectors there even may be direct reference to standards in the law, or an instrument the EU is increasingly using, the instrument of harmonized standards, which is not directly saying you have to comply with the standard to be legally compliant, but if you're compliant to the standard, the assumption is that you're legally compliant. There's other ways to prove that you're compliant, but the standard is one way to do that. The GDPR uses neither of those two, but generally references standards in certain articles, and in other articles the standards may and can still be helpful, but in no area does the GDPR mandate a specific standard to be implemented. However, it may very well be that de facto standards will lead to the assumption of compliance, because courts will say, okay, you implemented this, and this seems to be state of the art, which is another requirement that is mentioned several times in the GDPR, and as well as data protection agencies. But this may to some extent change the burden of proof, and so there is some impact of standards, but I think it is important to understand that we're currently not making the law if we're talking standards, and a lot of, especially people coming new to standards are always protesting certain things because we don't want to play the role of the lawmaker. And there's another final point. The general concept is policy or law should be policy neutral, and equally standards should be, the law should be technology neutral, let me get that right. The law should be technology neutral, and the standards should be policy neutral. In a lot of cases, that's not possible. There's overlap. But the concept and the idea to have these separate walls is very good.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that standards actually plays the role of operationalize a lot of the regulations, right? Where the regulations cannot get into the depth necessary for an engineer or practitioner to follow the regulations. Anybody care to comment on that?
Well, I was just going to say the word operationalize, the 27552, the Privacy Information System, Management System, is an example for one way to operationalize your internal, internal organizational system, and perhaps maybe becomes a de facto way, to perhaps to ease your burden for conformance. But of course, as you said, it's not a law, so we have to be very careful with that.
I was thinking during the initial positions that were presented by the panelists, I noted down the consensus-based approach mentioned also by Jan and Babak. And also after hearing Ali's presentation, it struck me that the logical procedure in order to reach this consensus is that a best practice or an approach that seems to work and is easily acceptable by all interested parties is something that may not bring you to the actual point of being compliant, but will should guide you during the compliance reaching path, since we're talking about GDPR now.
In fact, I mentioned open source and standards. Standards is one way to capture consensus. Open source is another way. And again, depending on which scenario we're talking about, there are different tools of the trade, right? International standards capture, consensus of the national delegations. Open source captures the consensus, technical consensus of the participants.
So another question I have is that we listed a long number of 5-digit numbers, right? And it's really probably difficult for our audience who are probably more of a GDPR practitioners or privacy practitioners to make much sense out of it. Is there a way to differentiate those that are more broadly applicable, such as you mentioned 27552 multiple times about the compliance, the GDPR, and how that might align, versus those that are more narrowly focused, such as the data portability standard that you mentioned. Can you kind of identify, the two buckets, and then perhaps explain to us how do you expect the two type of standards to kind of interact and leverage on each other, and help the audience understand how they interrelate, and as a result, help regulations to be more effective.
Who are you asking?
Anyone.
Well, I have a standard thing, and Johnny, I'm sure. Yeah. So the way I think, we mentioned 2 subcommittees already, 27, sorry about these numbers, but 27 is about security and privacy. 38, where I mostly hang out, is about cloud computing. There are 2 types. One way to think about these international standards is they come in roughly 2 buckets, very roughly. One is foundational ones, the ones that define core concepts of privacy. You guys have 29100. Standards that define core concepts and terminology for emerging technologies. Cloud computing is a good example. Now, Jan mentioned SC42 that was just created to do the same for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Again, build the terms, core concepts and foundations and fundamentals. And then these higher level standards, so like the ones that we can certify to, the ISMS style of standards, they use these core foundational concepts coming out of the international consensus process, and they build on top of them, and so-called operationalize, use them in operationalization of the system. That's one way I think about it.
I think the answer actually answers both of your questions to some extent. There's one important thing to understand. Standards, although it might appear counterintuitive, if you look at the strong hierarchy in the structure, is actually a bottom-up process. A standard will only be developed if there is somebody who wants that standard, is able and has the facilities to be an editor for that standard and to drive that effort forward. And if there is nothing coming out, there is not going to be a standard. So there is no way that I, as management of my working group, part of my management can decide, okay, it would be good to have this landscape, we need this, and this standard for that, so you go and do that. That's not going to happen. So there's kind of this growing effect, and that I understand that sometimes doesn't make it easier to understand how it works, and that's why there's a number of media and slides and documentation available to sort that out and to explain that, and my slides are going to be available afterwards, mapping the articles of the GDPR, and also giving an overview of the different standards that we have within our group. Now, in general, the differentiation is quite right, but I want to add another one that's quite important. That's the generic standards and the sector-specific standards. And especially in the context of the GDPR, that's quite important because a lot of things are very sector-specific or even application-specific. And that's things that sometimes we dive into as Working Group 5, but most often are better to be solved with the sector experts. And then they will look into those topics.
And those sector-specific ones most likely build on the foundational ones that are horizontal standards.
Yeah, I actually just had a quick, I was going to say, the sector-specific point, it makes a lot of sense. And if you're thinking about something like data portability, as you asked about, it's interesting because it's such a foundational and like broad mandate. And I think what's really important to understand about trying to create a common language in data portability is that you want to ensure that newcomers into any market are able to speak that language and to like allow people to try new things and to then be able to get their data back out if that thing either fails or doesn't work for that particular person. And so it has something that has to apply if it's going to work well to the very edge and to the very newest newcomers of technology, which might include as yet unimagined file formats. And so it's really just something that even in a month-long process, if you don't have a champion, but it has to apply broadly, is still kind of a long process.
Yeah, I guess data portability is kind of a very interesting beast. I was very happy to see that in the GDPR, although it's kind of alien to the whole regulatory approach, because essentially it's a regulation that is not so much also supporting privacy, but it's much more in favor of supporting market competition, which is an overlap that we are increasingly seeing, which is quite interesting. But I think it's very, very helpful for the users in the end. But it's a very different area, and that's a very good example also for seeing that only can be solved sector-specific. The underlying file formats for exchanging this data, this is not something we can do on a privacy committee or something like that.
Yeah, it is both privacy and competition. It's such an interesting topic.
Yeah. I mean, thinking that there is a silver bullet standards for data formats and file formats, so any data portability scenario will be taken care of. That's just naive, right? It's just the scenario is so complex, so widespread that that there's no, you can never build a canonical single silver bullet standard to address all your scenarios. And therefore, this is a case where perhaps open source in the vertical spaces or even at horizontal levels, open source lends itself better to addressing this challenge than creating a standard to rule them all, which is not possible.
Well, and perhaps to be like just a little bit more accurate, like it's not that you couldn't do it, it's that if you did it, it would have huge consequences, huge negative consequences. Yeah.
All right. I like that we start to riff off each other, and we want to keep that going, but we want the questions to come from the floor instead from the table here. So if we can.
Hello. I actually have two questions. The first one is, how do you see the fact that under Article 20 GDPR, you have to port not only content data, which is the classical view of portability, but also observed data, as the Article 29 Working Party says, at least. I would really like to see all of your views on that. And the second question is, especially from the point of view of cloud providers, how do you approach the fact that GDPR basically asks you to differentiate between the situation of B2B, when you are a processor for your client, and you have to make sure that you don't become a joint controller by controlling the means pursuant to which portability is made, and the B2C situation when you're a controller and you have to ensure that all of the controls are in place. Thank you.
I can answer the first question from our point of view. I don't know if I realized I went through the slides and the example pretty quickly. We do allow portability of the search history data, for example, and there's other sort of observed data, things that would be described as observed data that are available through that page on the thing. And it comes, I actually downloaded mine, which was mostly like shoes and airlines, so it was pretty embarrassing, and I've used it in presentations and it's sort of humiliating, but it comes out in a format that would be machine readable by the appropriate sort of reciprocal service, which I don't think there's anybody who has an intake function for search history data, but if you wanted to, you could build one and you would be able to port your search history from Google as an example of the observed data to that location.
Microsoft's solution is not that far different. And I point out that Article 20 has a technically feasible clause where the data can be downloaded. So the technically feasible part comes into play when there is somebody on the other side who has a scenario where they can make use of this data. And remember, I mentioned in my slides that for the data to be portable, really, it's not just syntactical portability. The underlying meaning of the data, the semantics has to also make sense. And of course, the regulatory laws and regulations in effect. So if there is demand for it, I think the open source, such open source community that we talked about could make use of it, and then code can be written to parse the downloaded observed data or customer data. So that's something that I think the community has to come together and test the usefulness and the feasibility and the demand for such type of data portability.
If I can restore I'll make sure we cover the questions of processor and controller's role of some of the couple of entities on the table.
Yeah. I'd have to ask you to raise that question again. It sounded very interesting, but I'm not sure I fully got it. So that would be helpful.
So in a B2B context, when you have a client, a corporate client, you are a processor from the point of view of GDPR. And you have to make sure, from my point of view, that you don't become a joint controller. That means that you have to not be the one that chooses the methods pursuant to which portability is put in place. Because if you do, then I guess it's very easy to be interpreted as being a joint controller with obviously additional liabilities. In the other situation, when you have a person being your client in a B2C, I think it's obvious, you're the controller, and then you really do have to ensure all of those means are in place. So I think it's kind of a practical contradiction at some point, because in one situation you have to have everything in place, and in the other one you have to basically empower your client to give their own customers the possibility to ensure portability? Thank you.
All right, now I got it, yeah. In my legal practice, I'm also struggling with that question quite a lot. And defining whether somebody has already jumped across the burden of being a controller by itself because he reuses the data for its own means and then effectively controls some of the purposes is a difficult task. But you are aware of the fact that even even processors are burdened with a lot of requirements that are not much less than those of the controller. But nevertheless, in those relationships, one has to decide what the relationship is, and that makes it often very hard for controllers to analyze the situation. But I think that's one of the assets also of the GDPR. From an organizational perspective, it enforces you to come clear with the structures you're implementing and to understand your own business processes. So there is actually added value to that. It can make your organization more effective. And that is not even new with the GDPR. In my previous life as a data protection agency, we also saw that when we were walking into organizations, often enough they would afterwards be very thankful, which is kind of surprising, you would guess, but they would be thankful because their processes would be much clearer afterwards. So that's the thing. But there is still quite some debate ongoing and will be happening during the next couple of weeks, months, and I suspect years on how to make that distinction.
All right, next question.
Some people know me, but so I have questions about how we build the standards. Today, we have those big trends on, let's say, big data, IoT, smart cities, and actually in JTC1, we created 3 working groups, and then we have standards ongoing, but those standards are for ecosystems, while all the standards you mentioned right now are for organizations. So if I'm an organization, I use 27552 for my own purpose, but then we have to integrate all the things. So we have to have the big picture, which is the objective of the other groups, but the standards, when they are written, it's hard to read because they are both for organizations, both for ecosystems. So do you see a trend, or shouldn't we agree on how we process? So that's my first question. I have another question for later.
Well, yeah, that's the internal GTC1 question.
You should have warned me. That's a difficult one. Actually, I don't have an answer right now. It is not easy to solve.
Okay.
See that. Yeah.
So maybe I can get to the second question because it's related. I like very much Babak's presentation when he did not oppose standards versus open source, but the open source solution he presented was very interesting because, first of all, there are some principles. So it's API oriented because of you need to have the API, and then transparency is solved because this is open source. So you can check, you can double check. So there's the implicit principle there. So these implicit principles, we can put them in the standard. Say, okay, please follow transparency. Please select whether it's API oriented or whether it's data oriented for interoperability. But the solution is also interesting. So how can we work together? Could we have the standard out of this, or could it as informative?
Well, I mentioned an international standard that just was published, 2 of them. One of them was the standards on interoperability and portability for cloud and services. That standard actually does talk about what you touched upon, which is fundamentals of requirements for interoperability and portability of code and data. And in fact, there are clauses in that standards that talks about the solutions such as using APIs or open source and when you use what. So what you're envisioning in terms of having a standard that is more of a foundational one that defines the ecosystem and becomes a foundational, more of an educational thing to answer the tough questions, and then people can then build on top of it. So there is such standard on case of portability, and the standard does point to open source actually as a viable venue. So in fact, it was heavily debated by the Olympic teams I mentioned. Everybody had an opinion, and thank God we had a consensus at the end.
Next question.
Thank you. Friederike from Privacy International. I have a question since the topic is standards. Not all privacy concerns fall under the domain of data protection. And there are a lot of discussions about artificial intelligence and standards. And I was wondering whether US industries see need for standards that address not just bias discrimination, but the privacy concerns of domain-specific AI applications, precisely where data protection like GDPR Article 22 falls short.
As John, you mentioned in your slides that there's a new subcommittee created in joint ISO-IEC system dedicated to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And you mentioned verticals, and Jan mentioned that we've referenced the fact that things have to be grounds up and grassroots. So before we talk about vertical industries' use of, for example, artificial intelligence, we need to arrive at an international consensus on the core concepts and terminology and architecture of the machine learning technology that is emerging. Until we have the common foundation so that we can have a meaningful conversation and don't talk past each other, until that's done, it's difficult to go vertical. So, and I hear this new subcommittee has a lot of energy, a lot of participation, so hopefully they'll make good progress and come back with consensus results that we can then build on top of.
I have a slightly different opinion on this. I have to respectfully disagree, and thank you very much for that question. I think the GDPR indeed falls very short in that area, has not tackled the core societal challenges that we're currently facing, and I would be very reluctant to entrust that topic to industry standards. That's not going to happen in my perspective. I think industry standards can work very well as soon as you have a good regulation in place, and then complement that as a form of self-organization, but it will not supplement it.
Right. If you were asking about whether ethics is a place for building standards, I totally agree. We engineering nerds, we shouldn't be doing ethics or fundamental human rights. We need to derive from existing consensus and build on top of it.
I don't have much to add. I just wanted to note it seems like they don't disagree quite as much as they're just using different sources of the foundational definition. So that's not really a official observation, but as long as I have a microphone, I thought I would share it.
All right, I'll entertain one more question and we'll close. No?
Cocktails.
I guess cocktail is calling. Chair? Oh, we have one more. Okay.
I have a question concerning the data portability destinations, where there's currently only 3 on the Google takeout service. So I have a question about standards for broadcasting that you might want to be listed in Google's, but also other big players in their takeout options. So are there standards for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the universe that Babak and I are describing is one in which it's not about having individual relationships between 2 companies, right, that are agreed upon or sort of negotiated, but rather building an open source format that allows companies to participate by building adapters and sort of working together to share data directly between 2 things. And so I think that the answer to your question is back to the open source solution, as opposed to saying anybody who wants to help Google be able to export their data come to here, and anybody who wants Microsoft to be able to export their data to their place go to Microsoft. It makes more sense to have sort of a big pool that allows file formats to move around more openly.
So maybe one way would be to progressively introduce existing standards into schema.org or something like that.
It's hard to hear. Can you speak louder into the microphone?
So Google and other industry players have set up schema.org, which is a system for websites to broadcast some information about their own content. But maybe through schema.org, you could start broadcasting information about your compliance, the way you are trying to comply with the standards that you guys were describing just now.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think that's it's an interesting point. I think one distinction I would make is that for us, at least, the data portability tool is not driven by the need to comply. It's something we've been doing for 10 years, and we're sort of looking at what's the next big step in it. So that's more of a political distinction, but I think it's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's already a lot of different mechanisms, such as schema.org, and certainly that's not the only one to broadcast the format and availability of formats. So, with that, let's close the session. Chair, would you like to?
I would like to make a final closing remark by paraphrasing a little bit what Babak Jahromi said earlier. I cannot recall right now that standards cannot be the silver bullet for everything. With regards to privacy, data protection, or even more specific GDPR, we are a couple of months away before May 25th. And still we're looking for guidelines or guidance in specific areas of the provision or the imposed requirements. So it's not something that standards will come out, emerge out of the blue and solve us all our problems. And as a thought, let's say, how I would like to perceive or how I would like to perceive what problems standards are about to solve with respect to GDPR, I'm thinking always of the analogy between privacy data protection certification. What problems is this aspect of GDPR going to solve? Meaning it's going to solve a couple of them, but maybe not all of them. Similarly, the technical standards. Thank you very much. I would like also to thank the moderator and the panelists, and also you for staying with us, even if it was the last session of the day. And I hope you enjoy the cocktails afterwards.